You're listening to Risk and Resolve. And now for your hosts, Ben Connor and Todd Hufford.
Welcome to another episode of the Risk and Resolve pod with our special guest today, Dave Neff, CEO of the Boilermaker Alliance. Dave, glad to have you today.
Hey, excited to be on. Excited for your guys' new endeavor here, Risk and Resolve.
Yeah. So obviously a lot of our listeners will probably be excited. The old boiler up deal, especially Todd as a Purdue alum. So he'll get to hear a little bit about your endeavors with Purdue and NIL here later. But I'm personally pumped to have you on, Dave, just because of our history and knowing each other for so long. Goes back
close to 30 years.
Wow. That's crazy.
Wow.
And the kind of the thing of like, you can't make old friends, you know?
Yeah.
But I remember vividly early morning hoops, driving across the street to pick you up, take you to basketball practice.
In your blue Mustang with your Dave Matthews Band bumper sticker.
That's right. Making sure that everyone knew what my music affinity was for. But
that's right.
No, just really excited to talk about also your professional journey and how, kind of weaving that together. And I've had a fun seat to kind of watch that along the way. But let's rewind the clock before we get into the Boilermaker Alliance stuff. Obviously, we went to school together at a private Christian school here in Indianapolis, and then you chose to go to Ball State. Kind of share with me, like, what was your journey like, and why did you select Ball State, and kind of what was your you chose a major of sports administration. So tell me a little bit about your journey of choosing Ball State and going through the program there.
Yeah, I wish I could give you some elaborate sort of plan here, but I think at least for me at 17, 18 years old, thinking about a college, I was a good student, worked hard, got good grades, but didn't necessarily cast like a super broad net at that time of my life of, I'm going to go visit all these colleges. And so, given where we went to high school here in Indy, private Christian school, I kind of thought, I could go that route in college or try to broaden my horizons, maybe go to a public, state school, that sort of thing. And so, as I was just kind of taking a look around, growing up, my father was a family practice physician, and I didn't necessarily have a strong pull to go into medicine like he did. I mean, it was great for him and our family. And so being active in sports, not being necessarily that great of an athlete, but enjoying it and working hard, I thought a lot about sports broadcasting. And you may recall, Ben, I think I was my senior year of high school. I was a year younger, but I was the PA announcer at our high school basketball game. So kind of dipped my toe in there. And, Ball State's known for their telecommunications program, given David Letterman being alum. And so that was really it. It wasn't anything crazy. Went there as a TCOM major actually first, my freshman year before transitioning into sports administration. And once I made that pivot, I really never looked back. I didn't even know that was a major back in 2003 when I went to college. Learned about it my freshman year, kind of the blending of business and sports and the different pathways from pro sports to college to running a YMCA, lots of different, pathways should you choose to go into that. And so played club soccer, ended up working in the athletic department a couple years at Ball State, got some great experience, was president of our sports administration club, and just did a lot as an undergrad to try to, build my experience and start to build my network. Cause that was the thing they always told us, was that it's very competitive to break into sports, and you're going to work long hours and not make very much money. So I was determined to get in. I might just have to work a lot, and I'd have to kind of grind my way to make a career out of it. So
really trying to sell the dream to you there on a lot of hours and no money, right?
That's right.
Making
a
sure
lot of people that go into sports, I think, are naturally competitive, right, may have played, and so maybe they know what buttons to push, right, to kind of see who's going to rise to the challenge. But
Yeah. So
yeah,
you went to the Pacers after
yeah,
Ball State.
yeah,
Was
that was
that
a
was
huge,
that like the dream? Like, hey, this is
yeah.
awesome.
Well, yeah, I'd interned in college for the RCA tennis championships, which some of your listeners may recall if they lived here in Indy. But that summer of 2006, it was not uncommon for me to be prospecting folks for the 2 weeks that the tennis tournament was here to get some tickets for the tournament. They had no idea that we even had a tennis tournament here in Indianapolis, and so I learned a lot early on about the power of a brand because whether you like the Pacers or not, everyone's heard of them in this city, right? There's only 30 NBA teams. So I could be on a plane to Mexico or wherever. And that was always a fun conversation topic of, oh, you work for the Pacers. And so, so that was a really fortunate break. And, I tend to believe things don't happen on accident. And one of my classmates, he's actually my co-president of the Sport Administration Club, Chris Evans. He had interned with the Pacers when I was interning for the tennis tournament. He ended up getting hired on full time, and I went back for my senior year at Ball State, and he called me midway through and just said, "Hey, there's a role that's opened up, and if you're interested, let me know." And so learned early on the power of relationships and classmates, quite frankly, being your biggest advocates. And so that was kind of what got my foot in the door. Him lobbying for me, and I had to earn it through the interview, but at least he helped get me an interview. And I was off to the races, Ben, before I'd even walked for graduation. I finished up classes, finals about 2 weeks before, came back and ended up walking for graduation, but I was already spring of 07 in the field that I wanted to be in my hometown, in the NBA, arguably at the highest level of sports, but starting off very, very entry level. But I was thrilled with the opportunity.
So your entry level at the Pacers, what was the initial experience like
Yeah,
going from college to professional world and
yeah.
just that environment?
Yeah, well, I think the first year, going to work at the time, what was it, Conseco Fieldhouse? Now it's Gamebridge. That was sort of a cool like pinch me moment, right? I mean, we'd play basketball down on the main floor at lunch a lot of days, and especially like long days when we'd be there for home games at night. Seeing the likes of Larry Bird walking down the hallway. Obviously, if you grew up in Indiana, that was pretty special. But I think more than anything, like that first year out of school, especially working in sports, anyone that tells you that's worked in sports would tell you the same. But just learning that pacing of, I was at the field house a lot. It was a good time in my life to be that way, just because I was single. I had, I wasn't married yet. Now I've got 4 kids, so in a different season of life. But the first year, kind of it wears you out. You've got to kind of get in shape, right? Because during the 6 or so months of the NBA season, it's not uncommon if you have 3 home games in a week that you're there, I don't know, 70, 80 hours a week. When you think about 8 to 5 plus, if you have a home game, you're probably not getting out of there till 9:30, 10 o'clock, and then you turn around and do it again. And so you learn to kind of just build that stamina, that endurance. And but that's by years 2, 3, and 4, I was there 4 years. It became much more normal, right? Just that pace and that tempo. So I think I feel like I had a strong work ethic just from how I was raised, and how I approached things the first 22 years of my life. Those next 4 years really, I think, continued to develop in me a motor that I think has stuck with me to today, as a now being 40. And so for me, a lot of my experiences and opportunities and relationships, all roads lead back to the Pacers. Like I'm so grateful for those 4 years, because I feel like it just opened a lot of doors and taught me a lot. That if I hadn't had that experience right out of college, I would be in a probably very different place today.
Yeah. You mentioned the word relationships a couple times already with networking, even at Ball State, and them encouraging to do that. And then just getting into the Pacers, getting the job at the Pacers, and then obviously in your role at the Pacers. What did you learn about more or less the relationship game, if you will, early in your career that you think is maybe change your course, for the rest of your career?
Yeah. I think it was a
So
great.
what would
The
you say
Pacers
about
was a
that?
really the Pacers was a really just unique platform and look into the city. While I had grown up in Indy, I wasn't really wired into sort of the civic community, and my family didn't go to a lot of Pacers or Colts games or things like that growing up. And so, um, working there gave me a really unique window into how the city works. When we host a Final Four or a Big Ten championship or eventually the Super Bowl in 2012, like the various parties that work together. Pacer Sports Entertainment's in the middle of that with Visit Indy and the Capital Improvement Board and the Indiana Sports Corps, and I've always been somebody I think is pretty curious and wants to kind of understand how things work, and having some great role models, quite frankly, early that I was exposed to, guys like Jim Morris, who had a big impact on me, and unfortunately passed away last summer of 24. Jim was named president of the Pacers about 6 months after I started. I didn't know who he was, and quickly got up to speed on just all the various things that he'd done over his career, pretty impactful roles in the city, and just a guy that prioritized, I feel like, relationships above all else. He was always playing the long game, always figuring out how he could be helpful and be of utility to others. And there wasn't always an immediate return in it for him. And I think when you do that, just like money, right? Relationships compound and time compounds. And now I can honestly see that 18 years into my career of just, if you're really, careful and thoughtful and you cultivate and nurture relationships, people don't forget that. And I think it can lead to some pretty cool opportunities. And so, yeah, just seeing Jim's example and then having the platform that I did, managing season ticket accounts my first couple years, ultimately trying to renew those for both companies and families. And then I moved into more suite sales, selling the corporate boxes and meeting a lot of the executives from Central Indiana. That was just something I always tried to remember. I read a great book during those years, the Pacers, probably around 2008, called Never Eat Alone by Keith Ferrazzi. And it was all about building success, one relationship at a time. And so, yeah, just sort of knew that it would have to be built brick by brick. There's no shortcut, right, in terms of building a meaningful network. I don't think it's about having the largest network, but I think it's about having the most sort of breadth and depth in terms of what makes it different.
Well, deep relationships sounds like led you to the next opportunity. Sports management, particularly in the ticket sales, that's a young man, a young woman's game, as you already mentioned.
Yeah.
It's a lot of hours, very condensed. So how did that next opportunity come about, and tell everybody what it was?
Yeah. So fall of 2011, I took an opportunity with ExactTarget, which at the time I remember somebody characterized it to me as the Google of Indianapolis, right? It was sort of this hot emerging tech company. Had been around for about 10 years when I joined. I think I was employee 1000. But yeah, I didn't have a tech background, right? But the executives at ExactTarget I had gotten to know because they'd bought a suite at the Pacers. And so one in particular, the chief marketing officer, Tim Kopp, at the time, had just really taken an interest in me and had kind of become a mentor outside of just being a client. And so I had been approached by some other pro sports teams, and I was probably about 26, still single, and was kind of thinking I might spread my wings and move outside Indy for a period, just because I'd grown up here, went to college an hour away, and was back. And so was interviewing with some teams out on the West Coast, down south, and was starting to confide in some mentors about it. And Tim, when I talked to him about it, he's like, well, why don't you just come over here? We're looking for someone with your background that understands the sports and entertainment space and kind of manage all of our strategic partnerships at ExactTarget, as well as work with our sales team on how do we position and sell to this specific vertical. And so, thought a lot about it, prayed about it, talked to some folks, and at the end of the day, ended up moving over there at 26. And some ways felt like I was starting over because I was going into an industry that I didn't really know. But I knew that this was a company that, and I didn't know much about IPOs or anything like that, but I knew this was a company that was on just a pretty unique growth trajectory. And so shortly after I joined, I think 9 months after I joined, we went public. And then a year later, Salesforce bought us. So I got to live through all of that in a pretty short amount of time. I left maybe 6 months after the Salesforce acquisition, but yeah, in the 2.5 years I was there, got to do some really unique things. That managed all of our partnerships with Andretti and IndyCar and the Pacers and the Colts, and then kind of worked with our sales teams across all of our geos, across 4 or 5 continents, on how do we sell and position our email software to the sports media and entertainment vertical. So it was a great experience. Went to Europe, went to South America, traveled all over the US. It was a ton of fun, and just a really unique culture that felt like lightning in a bottle those 3 years that I was at ExactTarget and Salesforce.
Right around that time, I know you made, outside it looked like you took a really big risk for you. You took a right turn and had the opportunity for a C-suite position with Edge Mentoring, but that next change, that was nonprofit, like starting entrepreneurial journey. Really, you're starting something from scratch, more or less. Tell us about like that experience of going to a nonprofit world, starting something from scratch. Like, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I would say, thinking about the name of this show, while some people might think going into NIL was risky or a dumb move, a little over a year ago, I think back to, I think it was almost 10, 11 years ago now that I resigned from Salesforce and decided to go all in on Edge. And that probably was the riskiest career move that I've made. And it didn't make a ton of sense on paper. I think I was 29. I was newly married. My wife had just moved here from Louisville. She was a nurse at the time. We didn't have kids. And again, I go back to relationships. Another key mentor in my life at that time, a guy by the name of Jeff Simmons. He's the CEO of Elanco. Got to know him through the Pacers as well. I'd been involved in a mentoring group with him and a group of guys for 3 or 4 years. And we called it our Edge group, after Proverbs 27:17, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. So he called me, one day in late 2013, about a month after I'd been married, and just said, "Hey, this Edge thing, we'd cobbled together 4 or 5 other groups with volunteer mentors and a group of 20-something mentees. And he said, we need a leader. I feel like we just need to kind of let these groups run their course. And, that'll be kind of what Edge was, 4 or 5 groups. And neat thing, but he's like, I just feel like there's a lot more potential here." And he didn't have time, obviously, to go run this full time. And so a lot of it was my relationship with him, my belief in him, my experience as a mentee in that group for 3 or 4 years. We'd have calls twice a month over Zoom, and just the value I got out of that. It was a kind of a third place that wasn't my work, and it wasn't where I went to church. It was sort of this, what we now call whole life intergenerational mentoring. And Ben, I know you led a group for a number of years, so you experienced that as a mentor. But it was just, and like anything entrepreneurial, you got to bet on yourself, right? So I felt like my belief in sort of the guy that was asking me to come do it with him, more or less, and then the product, if you will. And I knew that it would all come down to getting high caliber mentors. If we were able to do that, I think we could attract high caliber mentees. And so I thought, honestly, though, I'd do it for like 2 years, maybe help get it off the ground and hopefully find some success, then jump back to the private sector. And it turned into almost 6. And I learned a ton during that ride. We had our first 2 kids at home when I was there. We scaled it to mentees and mentors from, I think, 45 states, several countries, got a grant from the Lilly Endowment. We put on 6 leadership conferences called EdgeX, where we'd pack out a venue with 2,500 people with speakers like Tony Dungy and Bob Goff and Mitch Daniels. And it was just it was a really, really unique experience to have in my early 30s, leading a small yet growing organization. We were never more than $1 million budget. staff of 5 or 6, but learning to manage a scorecard, learning to report up to a board and lead a team and hire and fire and do something that was pretty meaningful, right? We weren't just selling widgets. We were, connecting mentors and mentees in these relationships. And I still get stories, I've been gone for 5 years, and I'll still, hear from mentors and mentees, some groups that I help put together that still meet once a month, right? Wow. That I quite frankly may have forgotten about that I even put together. And these folks have been in each other's weddings and big part of each other's lives. So yeah, it was a super rewarding, but on paper, I remember running into people those first couple months after leaving Salesforce, which was a household brand here in Indy, really nationally in the software space. And they're like, what are you doing? A mentoring organization? And so, I think God was humbling me a bit that like, it's not about my brand after my name. I'd worked for 2 great ones at the Pacers and ExactTarget Salesforce. And so having to build something and really, kind of not lean on that as sort of what gives me my identity. And my wife was a great resource and support during that time, because there were some times where I was like, did I make the right decision? Because it was sort of a backwards move on paper, but it became this platform that, I was leading at a relatively young age and opened up a whole new world of relationships that, still serve me well to this day.
Yeah. What are some other things when you look back on that experience where it was cloudy at the time of like just like you mentioned, you're like, was this the right move? Like it doesn't match what I've done before. What were some of those things now that you look back on that you're like, that really served the purpose in this way?
Yeah. Well, I think for me, like at that time in my life, basically 30 years old, early 30s, a lot of my peers, whatever field they're in, they're learning to do 1 or 2 things, pretty well. And I feel like my capacity was really stretched because I was forced to do some things that maybe I, quite frankly, wasn't ready to do or wasn't prepared to do in terms of leading an organization. And, you can't be good at everything, right? But having, being exposed to sort of things that, I'm not a CFO, right? So I'm not somebody that's not the greatest use of my time. But when you're in a small org and having to understand how to read sort of a P&L and understand what questions to ask, those sorts of things, like it was, humbling and sometimes you had to be vulnerable. Like, I don't know what the right answer is here, right? Lean on your board, lean on others outside the organization, advisors, mentors. And so I think just at the end of the day, like being pressure tested a little bit while I made mistakes, and there's probably certain settings where got a little defensive because, I wanted to do well and we were coming up short in an area. At the end of the day, like being stretched and being pressure tested and being a lot outside my comfort zone at times, like I had to get up and speak, as Ben, in front of like large groups of people. And I feel like that prepared me well and served me well, because I have to do that now in various community roles I have, or even in my day job with Boilermaker Alliance. I have to get up in front of sometimes groups of, very important people, both small and large, and be concise and deliver an engaging, sort of message. And so learning to do that at 30 was super, super helpful. Not to mention just learning how to operate and lead and manage a scorecard and those sorts of things.
Yeah. What was because obviously you went from like a for-profit sector to a nonprofit. What were some like interesting things learned? I've never been in a nonprofit setting like that. What were some interesting things that you learned about just that space in general that was interesting for you?
I think running a nonprofit is harder than running a business, quite frankly. And I've actually talked to business guys about this that have tried to, get into the nonprofit space. I mean, a lot of times you're, so much of, and there's really not that much difference other than it's a tax code difference. You still have to have money in the bank somehow, right? You have to, be able to pay your team. You have to have a vision. You have to, whatever it is you're selling, whether it's donors or some nonprofits, it is a fee for service. So there's a mixture of sort of revenue sources. Like you have to have a business plan, right? More or less, even if it's a nonprofit. And so sometimes I think, in business, you you have a product or a service, a widget or a benefit, in your case, insurance, and you guys are experts and you've honed that. Sometimes when you're in a nonprofit, whether it's Edge or pick another one, Wheeler Mission, you're really trying to influence. You have to lead and influence people to give of their spare time, right, to choose to volunteer, to potentially get warmed up to where they might contribute financially to your organization. And so it's very intense relationally. And so learning to juggle and manage a lot of relationships, it's hard to do that well at scale and to still maintain that level of like personalization, which I really put a premium on. And so I think scaling a startup nonprofit is just really difficult, right? Because there was times where it almost felt more manageable when it was smaller. And then as we were gaining some velocity, without more resources, right? Not that you just throw people at problems, but it became a lot, right? Where you're like, man, it's only a 5 or 6 person org with maybe $1 million in revenue, but you're thinking about it all the time. And it can be hard to find ways to sort of disconnect and recharge. Cause I felt like a lot of times a lot would have to run through me because I was the glue with the board or with donors or with mentors. And, sometimes you try to not be the cog. I believe in empowered leadership and getting out of the way, but at the end of the day, people want to talk to you. Right. And so yeah, it was a great experience, but there's probably more similarities than not. Right. I mean, having a budget, having a forecast.
Yeah, I can relate to that on scaling a small business of like, when most of the throughput runs through you or in some way connected to you, of how do you scale and empower others. And certainly the journey that we've been on over the last several years of growing our business and that sort of thing. Well, I wanted to spend some time digging into your current role with the Boilermaker Alliance. And maybe, as you talked about before we hit record, demystifying NIL a little bit. But tell us a little bit about like how the opportunity initially like came along for you, and like kind of what you also saw with this opportunity, and like as I view it, like the wild west, where all the cowboys live is now NIL.
Yeah. No, it's again a bit kind of how my career's gone. For somebody that's pretty goal oriented, I've learned you kind of can only really focus on maybe 3 years at a time, and you've got to take what the wind gives you and certain opportunities come along. And so after Edge, we didn't talk about it, but I went to Prolific, which was a consulting firm, as a chief revenue officer. It had some pretty good scale to it, and that was a great 4 years that I was there. But I got contacted in the fall of 23, Ben, by a executive recruiter who I've known for a while and as a friend, and he'd been hired by the board of the Boilermaker Alliance to find their CEO. And so obviously I'd heard about and paid attention to NIL. By no means was I an expert, but it was, when I thought about just the opportunity to get in more or less still on the ground floor of NIL, it's been around for 3 years, essentially now. And so this was, a little over a year ago, to get in, to learn the space. It's not going away, but it is evolving pretty rapidly. And to do it at a Big Ten school at Purdue, where obviously I'm not a grad, but think the world of it, especially after the decade of Mitch Daniels' leadership there. Purdue's on a tear and has a great reputation globally. And so to be able to work alongside an institution like Purdue, can still do it from Indy, where we're pretty rooted, and I get up there, a couple times a week, and just to learn and to meet, I work with so many different stakeholders, from not just our athletic department at Purdue, but head coaches and their staffs. Obviously we work with student athletes, work with the board of trustees. I've got my own board at the Alliance. And so for those that don't know, I run Boilermaker Alliance, which is the collective that sits outside of Purdue University. Legally, we have to, but we are the exclusive collective of Purdue University athletics. So I view it as really we're an extension of the team. Again, there has to be sunlight between the collective and the university legally, but any student athlete that receives NIL money at Purdue, they're on contract with us. And so we probably work with 100 student athletes from 7 or 8 different sports. Obviously, we work a lot with football and men's basketball, given that those are the 2 revenue generating sports that sort of carry all the other programs. But the entire women's volleyball team's on contract with us, work with some women's basketball, some baseball, tennis, golf. And so, yeah, it's been a great experience. Obviously, I joined 4 months before Purdue went to the Final Four in Phoenix last April, which was a great experience. And then we had a pretty rough football season. So I got to experience both extremes of the good and sort of the tougher times, and got a new football coach a month or 2 ago. So rebuilding there. But, at the end of the day, the collective is out working with individual donors as well as companies in some cases that sort of see the value that our student athletes at Purdue bring to the university. And so any student athlete that is on contract with us, they're 1099 employees at the collective, they're required, their obligations in their contract stipulate that they have to serve at nonprofits a certain amount of times a month, and then leverage their platforms, their social media to promote those charities in return. And so we manage all of that through a software and through just a documentation process, so that we're doing everything above board, and we take that very seriously, so that it's not just pay to play, as some people might call it at other schools, where they're just paying kids and they don't have to do anything for it. We really believe that while we're trying to build champions, on the field or on the court, we also want them at this sort of these formative years to be champions in their community, and really, finding things that they're passionate about, whether it's the Boys and Girls Club or reading at elementary schools, or, showing up at a varsity blood bank drive, and again, leveraging sort of their brand, their likeness to bring benefit to the charities and causes they care about.
So, Dave, we're obviously in Indianapolis, home of the NCAA. So
Yeah.
There's been this topic floating around here probably longer, or at least more loudly. Yeah. Give our listeners just a little bit of background on, like, what was there a law? Was it legislation? What actually enacted this that we today call NIL, which of course stands for name, image, and likeness? When did it roughly start? When did it heat up? Those kind of things.
Yeah. So on July 1st of 2021, so what's that, about 3.5 years ago now, there'd been several court cases, and culminating in one that really allowed, as of July 1st, 2021, student athletes to finally financially profit off of their own name, image, and likeness, their personal brand, right? And you could go back to, a lot of people recall Ed O'Bannon, who was a basketball player at UCLA. A lot of this started with, you think about video games or jersey sales. Schools were making a lot of money off of jersey sales, and none of that money obviously would flow to the student athletes, right? Or video games, EA Sports, those types of things where their likenesses are being used, but they don't see any of that. And probably the old school thought is, well, they get a scholarship, that should be enough, right? They're amateurs. Yep. And I think the reality is that college athletics has become an economic machine. You see that with the rising salaries of football coaches, basketball coaches, support staff, administrators. I mean, we've got college football coaches making $13-12 million a year. And it's become big business, big money. And, does that mean that student athletes should get paid that same amount? Maybe not, but I think them sharing in a slice of that pie, you could argue, makes sense. And so, I think a couple of things converge that probably weren't originally designed to converge, and that is NIL from 3.5 years ago to the transfer portal, right? Which, when I took this role a little over a year ago, the rule was still that you could transfer once as an undergrad and once as a grad student, right? And then a few months into me taking the job, this was probably spring of 24, there was an injunction, another court case, where basically just stayed the fact that hey, student athletes can now transfer unlimited as much as they want, right? And so now it's almost like become anytime there's an open portal window, which those are designated times throughout the year, depending on the sport, it becomes this, in some cases, it feels like you read about bidding wars, right? Where so-and-so is throwing their name in the portal. And just because you enter the portal doesn't mean you're going to switch schools. Sometimes people enter the portal and end up staying at their school, right? But schools then are, once they're in the portal, you're legally allowed to contact that student athlete. And again, when I started, you couldn't be specific about what you could pay them in NIL. You could kind of use generalities and say, hey, well, we have someone over here that is in a similar, position as you, and here's what their package looks like. We see you in a similar package. Now you can be very direct and specific. So it's like, hey, if you come here, we want to put you on full ride. We can pay you X amount of dollars a month in NIL, and it's just evolved very quickly just in the last year. And then as we look forward to this summer, July 1st, revenue sharing is set to begin, and this is as a result of the House versus the NCAA settlement, again, which was not in motion until May of 24. There was preliminary approval granted in October of 24, and then April 7th is sort of the big date coming up that the judge will either approve the settlement or maybe not. But the Power Four conferences are certainly planning on revenue sharing to start July 1st, which means schools can now just start directly compensating student athletes, which again, to date, it's all gone through collectives. So it'll be an interesting year. So say what?
So how will that change? Will Purdue adjust to have some money pay athletes through the collective and some directly from the university based upon this?
Yeah. We're working through that right now as well as I know every other school, especially at the Power Four conference level. And the settlement, without getting into too much legalities, they're really trying to rein in the sort of the donor piece of collectives, the charitable contributions, because that can get a little bit all over the place. But they do, it will be permissible, is our understanding, to keep a for-profit collective that's focused on true endorsements and NIL deals. And so we're working through that right now, what that could look like at Purdue, whether that comes in-house, whether that's still a third-party collective that's, again, just focused on working with brands that would want to, an Eli Lilly and Company or a Rohrman, just using a couple of local examples that may want to partner with Purdue student athletes, a Braden Smith, a women's volleyball player, something along those lines. So it's a pretty dynamic time. And while that's in 5 months, we're actively kind of working on plans towards that end, but we got to obviously get through April 7th, which is this big sort of date on the judge's calendar to see if this settlement does in fact get approved. So
what role, if any, does the NCAA still play? Because everything you've said, it sounds like all the rules are being promulgated via court cases. It's kind of like the outcome of the court case then kind of tells you what you can't do, and then you kind of then figure, okay, well, then everything else is what you can do. Does the NCAA play any role in this today?
Yeah, that's a great question, and they do. And I think this House versus NCAA settlement, and I know the NCAA obviously hopes that it does settle so they don't have to go to court. Will help to probably rein some things in to where the NCAA is obviously adapting, and their goal is to obviously, they still administer a lot of college championships. They don't obviously do college football, right? I think that was 10 years or so ago that the college football playoff started. But men's basketball is obviously a huge revenue driver for the NCAA, the March Madness tournament. But then they do a bunch of other championships that don't often get a ton of airtime. And so, they still wield a lot of influence. But it's also, I know, been probably a challenging few years, right? You've got all these individual states have their own NIL statutes or laws. Now we don't have one in Indiana, and I don't claim to know why that is. Maybe it is because the NCAA is in our backyard, but you've got 50 states, and they probably, if they do have an NIL law, they're all a little bit different. So that's why you hear about the NCAA lobbying Congress to say we need to get some uniformity here, right, as we move into the future. I think if I were to have a crystal ball, when you look at professional sports, obviously they have things called collective bargaining agreements, and feels like sometime in the future that will probably come into play here. And I don't know the timing of that, but it's just, it truly, as you said, Ben, at the top, the wild, wild west. A lot of people say that it's accurate, but for me, it's been fun because I'm probably not somebody that would thrive just in a very normal, boring 9 to 5. So to kind of be on the leading edge and cutting edge and learning and having to adapt, yeah, it can be stressful at times, but it's been pretty rewarding and fulfilling, especially to do it at a place like Purdue.
Yeah, it kind of just makes me think of like the Hamilton play where he talks about just being in the room where it happens, you know?
Yeah. No, that's a good analogy.
You mentioned Purdue's. You said it was our strategy or our belief at Purdue is that, you know, obviously we're believers in NIL, but we also want these student athletes to be involved in the community as well. So I guess my question to that is, are there like a lot of varying strategies of like universities having a mindset like that, or if it's just a pay to play, or if there's a different strategy?
Yeah.
Is there a lot of different things that universities are pursuing at this point?
Yeah, I would say it definitely varies institution to institution. You know, I think obviously I can only speak on behalf of the collective. I can't speak on behalf of the athletic department, but you know, Purdue has, I think, 600,000 living alumni, right? And so, and I've learned a lot about just sort of the makeup. Obviously, a lot of people talk about Purdue being a STEM school, pumps out. I think we have 10,000, you know, engineering majors of the 50,000 undergrads. Big ag background presence. We obviously put people on the moon, like Neil Armstrong, astronauts, and so, you know, I think that lends itself to being a more just conservative sort of alumni base. And so sometimes it's they're one of the more just humble, educated, passionate sports fan bases that I've interacted with. I mean, we had a rough 1-11 football season, and Ross-Ade Stadium was full almost every game. I mean, I think it holds 62,000. Last game against Penn State, last home game of the season, they had 58,000 people there. I mean, it's a pretty remarkable loyalty in terms of the fan base. Obviously, men's basketball, women's volleyball was in the Sweet 16. We've got some tremendous programs right now at Purdue, and so they care, they're loyal. But it's not just wins and losses at a place like Purdue. Some schools, it probably is just that. I think when you go to Purdue, you know, you're choosing hard a little bit, right? West Lafayette is not the South, and it's not always the easiest place to get to if you're not from around the Midwest. You're going to be pushed academically, right? It's a rigorous academic institution as a state school, but you're going to also leave with a elite education and a great network of alumni that'll support you. And so, yeah, I mean, I think we are, Purdue was probably a little late to the game in NIL because they weren't, you know, I won't name other schools. They weren't paying folks previously under the table. I think some schools probably just brought their operation from under the table to above the table. So they had infrastructure already in place, but so we've had to catch up a bit, but I think Purdue alums can be very proud that we've done it the right way. You know, we've done it with high character, integrity, excellence, and I've really tried to mirror, you know, what Purdue's all about in terms of their core values.
Yeah, it's interesting that sounds a lot like that thread that you even talked about with Edge mentoring, that it's whole person care. It's not just about this or that.
Yeah.
So it's not just about the athletics. You care about them involved with community, how they handle themselves as people, you know, as a student. That's pretty cool. How does all of this is something I've thought about a lot lately. Like, how does this change the landscape of like college athletics? Because I just think of the dynamic of, and they probably aren't, you know, they're probably not in the freshman, potentially not on the freshman dorm like other players. But if you have a freshman athlete making hundreds of thousands of dollars, having a roommate that's freshman that's like the rest of us were broke as a joke. Like what a dynamic that is.
Yeah.
So what does that do for the landscape of college athletics?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, I'm not in those rooms, but something that we've worked hard. We've partnered up with. There's a former student athlete at Purdue, young guy. He's getting his master's in accounting, and he came to us and was like, he'd been in the locker rooms, right, where guys were getting NIL payments, and just really developed a passion for how do we equip these young men and women with financial acumen, right? To your point, if they're making, let's say, $100,000 or even $50,000 or less, sometimes more, from the time of 18 to 22, or now it feels like you read about 25-year-old college student athletes, because hey, if you can get a fifth or sixth year and make a little bit more money, and the reality is 99% of these student athletes won't play at the next level, right? So but if you can make a handsome six figures, or in some cases seven figures, and that early in your life, right? Just let the power of compound interest do its thing, and don't touch a lot of it, right? And so we've partnered with this young man who came to us, and also came to the athletic department, and he had been working with a couple professors in the Daniel School of Business at Purdue, and they've created like a 9-class course that they've been kind of rolling out and meeting with the various varsity teams at Purdue. Everything from the basics of personal finance, saving, investing, accounting, taxes, all those sorts of things. And we feel like, again, that's in line with who Purdue is and as an institution, and could be a real arrow in the quiver, as this gets rolled out for recruiting, right? To instill confidence with parents that are thinking about their son or daughter coming to Purdue. And, I think at the end of the day, relationships, culture, chemistry, leadership, those things still matter, right? And there's young people that I think hunger for that. They're not just about where can I go get paid the most, or secure the bag, right? As young people say. And so I think, knowing that Purdue is going to kind of look for people that fit, that are program guys and girls that fit sort of the Purdue brand. It's not going to be for everyone, right? And that's okay. We're all right with that. But I think I've been able to see that through some of our coaches at our various programs at Purdue. Their approach to how they recruit and the types of people they're after.
How does that change? How does this change the coach's approach from your perspective of previous? It was, how good of a recruiter are you, player development, and doing that over the course of 4 years. How does this change the coach's dynamic, and what decisions do they have to make?
Well, take, for example, our new football coach at Purdue, Barry Odom, got here middle of December, right? So he's not even 2 months in on the job. There was a December transfer portal for football, and I think we added 40 guys. Okay. 29 from the transfer portal, meaning they were at other colleges, 11 high school guys. Okay. And I can speak obviously pretty candidly on our men's basketball program. Matt Painter is obviously one of the best college basketball coaches there is currently, and he didn't even touch the transfer portal this past men's basketball portal, which is kind of unheard of in today's culture. And so he is still running, and I believe Barry Odom, our football coach, will do the same, a development-oriented program, right, where they're recruiting high school guys and planning to be with them 3-4 years and really develop them over time. Look at Zach Edey, who became a 2-time National Player of the Year. He was the 436th ranked recruit in his high school class, becomes a 2-time National Player of the Year. Now is the number 9 pick in the NBA and having a great rookie season. That's all Matt Painter and his staff right there. And so, football is a little bit different because you have 85 scholarship guys compared to 13 for men's basketball. So the nature, just the volume of guys on the roster, it's naturally going to be more transactional, right? Where I don't care if you're Ohio State, who just won the national championship, or Purdue that was 1-11. We're probably both having to deal with the portal, right? For various reasons, guys at Ohio State that want to play more and felt like they never saw the field, guys at Purdue because we had a coaching change or because we had a rough season that want to go elsewhere and think they have a better chance of winning or playing. And so, yeah, football, it's probably a little harder to do. That's my perspective, just because you have so many guys. So to keep all 85 sort of in a development oriented, it's just harder, right? Because there's a lot more cooks in the kitchen versus you can be a little bit more contained with 13 guys and some walk-ons on your basketball program.
Yeah, it's been interesting on football broadcast. I feel like 20% of the time they're saying who was in the portal and where they were last year. It's like,
Yeah.
20% of the broadcast. Well, Dave, thanks for coming on today and having a conversation and teaching us some of the lessons you've learned along the way and talking through NIL. It's also a great pleasure from my perspective, knowing you for so long and just seeing you continue to just excel in everything that you do. So we end our show with two questions that we have for every guest that I want to ask you. So the first one being is, let me get to my note here. What is a risk you have taken that has changed your life?
Yeah. I'll go back to that decision at 29 to resign from Salesforce and go all in on edge mentoring. Felt a lot riskier than what I just did, a little over a year ago, jumping into NIL, just at the season of life. And it was a pay cut. It was a benefit cut. It was a startup nonprofit. And it was risky, like I said, on paper, but just felt like it was almost like a calling, right? For a lot of reasons that I felt I should go there, and felt like that got affirmed in so many ways over the 6 years that I was with Edge. And again, learned so many lessons, got humbled. But I think I wouldn't, again, have some of these leadership opportunities, both, in my day job, now at Boilermaker Alliance, and in the community, had it not been for sort of taking that leap of faith and going all in on Edge. I could have stayed a cog at Salesforce or, a great brand like that. But that really, forced me to have to really become an entrepreneur, right? And not just kind of hide behind whatever the brand of the companies I worked for, the pedigree of the schools you went to. And it's like, okay, what can you actually do, right? And I think that's a great lesson in entrepreneurship, right? Like, you have to drive outcomes daily, it feels like. So versus having other people sort of do it for you. So
yeah, it seems like you got and we haven't really talked about this much, but you mentioned it today. It seemed like you got a lot of external not challenge, that's probably not the right word, but what did you do, or why did you do that? So
yeah,
probably finding that affirmation was in the quiet places, I would imagine.
Yeah, exactly.
So the second question is, what's unfinished for you that you have the resolve to complete in the near or not so near future?
Yeah, and I don't even know, as I was thinking about this, I don't know if there's my mind didn't necessarily go to a professional sort of thing. It was more like me personally, turned 40 a little over a month ago. And so that obviously causes some reflection of just how's life going. And I've got 4 young kids, the oldest of which is 8. And so, really working on myself, not just, physical things or professional things, but as a husband, as a father, even my own internal landscape, right? As guys, we don't talk a lot about our feelings or emotions often, but, making sure I'm healthy, right? Because there's a lot pulling at me right now in this season. And I know I've got a pretty narrow window where my kids actually want to hang around me. I don't think it's 18 years, Todd. Your kids are older. It's probably like 10 years. And then they want to hang with their own friends, right? I'm already seeing that with my son, who's almost 9. But, so I think while I'm kind of living in the tension of being the best professional and best, community leader and those sorts of things, places where it's easy to get a lot of affirmation, like working on myself so that I show up as a, just a healthy husband, father, friend, can kind of live at peace within myself, as there are a lot of just pressures and things pulling at you right now, and making sure I don't get tripped up by any of the landmines that you see folks in midlife sometimes deal with.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I also love, just in that vein of seeing, I know you have to, it's part of the role, but also fun to go to some of those basketball games or whatever, but I love seeing you with your children, taking them the chances you get to enjoy the experience with you. And I think that is incredible. But Dave, thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, guys. Love that you're doing this. This was fun.
All right. Thanks, brother.